Norway. Today, Ellie Targett, formerly a radio presenter in Herefordshire and a regular speaker on cruise ships, and well known as a speaker for organisations like our own, is here to take us back in time to the Second World War. Not in Britain, France or Germany, but back in time to Scandinavia and her father's amazing story of escape from captivity and survival in those unforgiving climates. Please welcome Ellie Targett.
I don't know whether we can put some lights down here, because I feel as if you're just watching me, you should be watching the screen. Is there any possibility we can have a bit more light on the screen and less on me? So you can see that, that's a bit better. Is that better? Okay, you can all see, and you can all hear me. Thank you, first of all, very much indeed for inviting me along. It's lovely to see so many of you. I'm going to talk for about 45-50 minutes, and we've got quite a bit to rattle through, so I'm going to take questions at the end. Now this, as Vivian says, is a story about my father, Sven Sømme, who was a Norwegian. He was a professor of freshwater marine biology, and he was a world authority on salmon. He was also the leading scientist in Europe in the 1950s, and he was the first scientist to discover that salmon migrate and then 4 years later go back to their river of spawning. And this is the story of what happened to him during the Second World War. He was one of five. There you can see him. He was the youngest of five. And his brothers and sisters were all in the Norwegian resistance during the Second World War. His brother Yakov was the only one who didn't survive that horror. And I was born and brought up in Norway, and we lived on the west coast, just outside the town of Molde. And here you can see we looked out onto the Molde fjord and the Romsdal mountains behind. It was a very, very beautiful town. It still is, of course. And we had a very happy childhood. My father was very often away. He travelled a lot with his work. He worked for the Norwegian government as the inspector of fisheries for the whole of Norway. And when he came home, he had a little whistle, and it went, and there was a reply to that whistle which went. So when Papa was away, we'd hear the car come back, and the first thing we'd hear was. And his father had also used the whistle. His father was the doctor at the local sanatorium in Molde, and my father spent part of his childhood in the town, and his father used the whistle as well. It became a bit of a Sømme whistle. And if you go to Molde to this day, you'll hear people still talking about Sven Sømme with great fondness and great respect. He was very well liked. He was a great personality, great character. He had a wonderful sense of humour, like most Norwegians. We never knew quite what he was up to. We absolutely adored him. Like most Norwegians, he spoke very good English, but he also spoke fluent German as well. And there you can see my brother Bertie on the left, and my sister Julie in the middle. I'm the oldest of the three of us. School was never closed when there was 4 feet of snow on the ground, and even our teachers managed to get to school. And here you can see we would build these lovely snow huts, and we'd sit inside with a candle, and Mum would bring lunch out to us, and we'd have a lovely, cosy time. Of course, nowadays you couldn't do that, because you'd be worried about the snow collapsing and burying the children, wouldn't you? But somehow we survived those terrifying horrors. And we also had a little caravan that we called the Bounty. And I can remember going camping in midwinter when the snow had covered the road. Here you can see it's summertime, and the local chap has come across with his boat. And between them, he and my father have manhandled the old Volvo onto the boat, and they're busy using a couple of planks manhandling the Bounty on behind. Because nowadays health and safety would stop her, wouldn't they? You know we did survive. Do you remember these prams? Ice cream? People of a certain age, we all remember them, don't we? And here you can see little Bertie, at the age of about 18 months, being wheeled in to the boat and waving excitedly to the crowd of 2 boys who'd come to see us off. And in the summer, Julie and I danced at the local museum, and we wore the bunad, which is Norway's national costume. And everyone in Norway has a costume, has a bunad. The men's are just as beautiful as the women's. And every district has its own. We have the Romsdal bunad. And they're very proud of their bunad, the Norwegians. They wear them for every occasion. For weddings, when the bride will wear her bunad with a crown on top of her head, and all the people will dress in theirs, and for funerals, for christenings, for birthdays, and particularly for the 17th of May. 17th Mai is Norway's national day. And if you go to Norway on that day, you'll see people proudly walking through the countryside and the towns and villages wearing their bunad. Have any of you been to Norway? Yeah. There's quite a few. Have you seen the bunad? Yeah. I always think it's so sad, isn't it? We've got Scotland, Ireland and Wales with a national costume, but England, with all our ancient history, we have nothing really, except we do have the Morris dancers, don't we? In 1940, Norway was governed by a Labour government with a communist element in it. It was a very peaceful country. Norway had managed to remain neutral during the previous war, and they were very keen to remain neutral during the coming conflict of World War II. And here we can see the Storting standing outside the Houses of Parliament in Oslo. But Hitler had other ideas. On the 9th of April 1940, Hitler sent some 500,000 troops, ships and tanks to invade a peaceful country. As they bombed their way up the coast, starting in Oslo and moving up to Bergen and Stavanger and up the coast, thousands of people were killed and made homeless, and many people fled into neighbouring Sweden, which of course remained neutral during the coming conflict. But the Germans didn't have it all their own way on the 9th of April. As the SS Lucker, which was carrying a large number of troops, sailed disdainfully up the Oslo fjord very early at 4 o'clock on that morning of the 9th of April, she had her guns pointing forward, and she wasn't expecting to meet any sort of resistance. As she began to get towards the Oscarsborg fort, which lay on the left-hand side of the Drøbak Narrows, there were no lights on at the fort, but suddenly a searchlight was opened up from the other side of the bank and shone on her, and 2 torpedoes were sent out and hit her amidships. And she began to list up the fjord, and as she passed Oscarsborg fort, 2 28mm Krupp guns, which were slow but packed a deadly punch, were opened up and again hit her amidships, and she sank with a loss of over 1,000 lives. The Germans immediately took reprisals and bombed Oscarsborg fort. But the Norwegians now could only watch helplessly as the German troops marched into the capital. Here they are marching down Karl Johansgate, a very famous street in the centre of Oslo, and you can see the Norwegians standing by. Norway had a very small navy and a small army. The Allies were occupying Narvik at the time, up in the north of Norway, and the Allies and the Norwegians fought valiantly for about 2 months, but eventually they were beaten by the German superior force, and the Allies withdrew, leaving Norway to its own devices. The German army were now ordered to be fed by the German Gestapo officers, who said to the Norwegians, "You must feed our army." Well, when you have a population of 2.5 million, and you suddenly find yourself having to feed another 500,000 very hungry soldiers, you begin to run out of food. And Norwegians, after the first year of the occupation, were beginning to starve, literally starve. They had nothing. The German commandant, Joseph Terboven, set himself up to rule Norway under the control of the Third Reich. And here we see the German commandant and his officers making themselves at home outside the Nationaltheater, the National Theatre, in the centre of Oslo. King Haakon VII and his government fled up the coast of Norway, first to Hamar and then to Molde, where the king hid above the town. Before he left Norway, he ordered that these little fishing boats should be commandeered to ship the gold bullion that Norway held in gold bars out of the country, and that was shipped to the UK, where it was held for the duration of the war and was to pay for the war effort for the Norwegians. But the king could now only stand and watch helplessly above the town of Molde as the Germans set about flattening the town. There wasn't much left by the time the Germans had finished. But the British Navy came in eventually and managed to get the king away. to safety in England. Of course, if the Germans had managed to capture the king and the royal family and the government, they would have all disappeared. Quisling, of course you've heard of Vidkun Quisling, the Norwegian Nazi sympathizer, set himself up to rule Norway under the auspices of the Third Reich, and he set up also the Nationalsamling, which was a group of about 30,000 young Norwegians who were indoctrinated into the Nazi propaganda. Here we see them congregating in a hall. It says, with Quisling for Norway at the top there. But thousands and thousands of young Norwegians who were called up for that escaped across the border into Sweden. They wanted nothing to do with it. Quisling ordered now that the Norwegian flag should be hung above Akershus Castle in Oslo. It's at the foot of it's at the mouth of the fjord there, to show Norwegians that Norway was once again governed by Norwegians. Of course, most Norwegians were very sceptical of that and very cynical, didn't believe it. There was a little village that lay up on the west coast of Norway, just outside Bergen, and it became a very important place for the SOE agents that England was sending across, Special Operations Executive, which had been set up by Churchill at the beginning of the war to take agents in and out of occupied Europe. And there were agents, English agents, going in and out of this village, Televarg. There was an arms cache there which was hidden for the eventual liberation of Norway. And the villagers knew about the SOE agents going in and out, and they were then able to spread into the rest of Norway and go into hiding and so on. But there was a woman in the village who discovered one day that she hadn't been given her proper coffee rations for that week. And she was very angry about it. And she also discovered that there were 2 SOE agents hiding in the village. And so she went to the local Gestapo officer and informed on the agents. There was a gunfight. One of the agents was killed. The other was very badly wounded and taken prisoner, along with the leader of Mylorg, the military wing of the resistance movement in that area. The Germans also held 20 young Norwegian men who were completely innocent of this, but they held them hostage. One of those young men had already died, so they had 19 hostages. The 2 agents were very, very badly tortured and then executed, and the 19 young men were put up against a wall and also shot. And then the Germans set about demolishing the village. All the men between the ages of 16 and 60 were rounded up and sent to concentration camps abroad, where most of them perished. The men, women and children who were left were rounded up and sent to concentration camps within Norway, where again a lot of them perished. The animals were all rounded up and slaughtered. The fishing boats which belonged to the village were sunk. And then the Germans set about demolishing the village itself. And that's all that was left. So now you can see what the Norwegians were beginning to suffer under the German occupation. This was a daily occurrence of executions and torture which the Germans inflicted on the Norwegian population, one of terror, for 5 long years. There was something like 790 Jews in Norway at the time. They were living peacefully as part of the community. They had been there for centuries. Most of them tried to flee. Most of them were rounded up, and of course we know what happened to them. Only 29 Jews survived the war in Norway. There were also now long queues forming outside the shops. People were beginning to literally starve. My aunt told me once that all she had to feed her children on one winter was cabbages. And she said it's amazing the number of ways you can find to cook a cabbage. But I also read recently that some people were reduced to eking out their flour supplies with sawdust. And here you can see they had absolutely nothing. You were forbidden to wear or to carry the Norwegian flag. This lady risked arrest by proudly wearing the flag on the back of her coat. So Norwegians took to wearing a paperclip in their lapel, which showed other Norwegians that they were good Norwegians. Then we had, of course, the bombing of the heavy water recount. You probably remember the film The Heroes of Telemite, which was a bit Hollywoodized. There wasn't a woman up in the mountains making beautiful meals for them. But Norway produced heavy water for peaceful purposes, before the war. They produced about 500 pounds of heavy water. The Germans had discovered that heavy water was needed for the production of the atom bomb. And the Germans were very keen to get the atom bomb. And of course, if they had managed to get that bomb, London would have capitulated. There's no doubt there would have been a very different outcome to the war. The Germans ordered that production at the Van factory should be increased to £3,000 a year, and then eventually this heavy water would be shipped to Germany for the production of the atom bomb. Several times the Allies, the Americans and the Norwegians managed to bomb the factory and put it out of action. Several Norwegians and Allied soldiers were killed in those bombing raids, but each time the Germans rebuilt the factory and resumed production. Then at the end of 1943, the Germans decided that production was too difficult and dangerous at the Van factory. They decided that what they had would be shipped to Germany. Two men managed to get onto a boat. The plan was, this is a man called Knut Haukeli, who was a Norwegian. He was a friend of my father's. He and a colleague managed to get themselves on board the ferry at Lake Tinsha, which was to take the heavy water across to the main part of the island, or the land where it would be shipped down into Germany by train. They managed to get on board the ferry before it sailed, and they set two bombs, which exploded as the ferry crossed the deepest part of the water. That, of course, was a very dangerous mission. 20 Norwegians died in that bombing, but the heavy water was sunk and went to the bottom of the lake. So that was the end of Hitler's proposals for the atomic bomb. In 1940, my father was stationed on the island of Gossen, which is a large flat island which lies off the coast of Malta, and there he ran the Fiskerfag School, which is a fishery school. It's still there, and it's still in the same position. The Germans occupied the island. They sent 5,000 troops to the island, made themselves very much at home, and the first thing they did was to build an airfield, because Hitler was convinced that the Allies were going to invade the west coast of Norway, which eventually, of course, they did. The island was ruled by a man called Otto, and if I tell you that the island became known as Hell Island throughout the war, you'll understand what conditions were like on the island. Here we see the German commandant and his officers making themselves at home on the island. There was something like 800 families on the island, and I heard recently from a man who came to visit me that those 800 families were given less than a week to get out of their houses and to go and find accommodation elsewhere. Those houses were commandeered by German officers and the soldiers, and all their possessions, including their clothes and their furniture, were put on big bonfires and burned. They lost everything. They had to go and stay with friends. One day, the German commandant approached my father, who had a house which went with his job as director of the Fiskerfag School, the fishery school on the island, and he demanded his house. There was nothing he could do about it. He had to give up his house. But he was permitted to live upstairs in the little flat above the German commandant. Everyone in Norway at the beginning of the occupation had been told to give up their radio. It became an illegal act to have a radio. You were not allowed to listen to any news or any speeches that were coming across. All the news you had was German propaganda. That was the only news you were allowed to listen to, was German propaganda. And my father kept his radio at great risk to himself. Of course, he could have faced firing squad for that. It was a very dangerous thing to do. And at night, when the German commandant and his officers were having raucous parties in the main part of the house, getting themselves very drunk most nights, my father took his little radio, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, he stole down into the cellar below the German officers. They were above. And he would tune his radio into the BBC. And he began to listen to Churchill's speeches and also to the news reports coming across. And he wrote them down, and he began to produce a little underground newspaper. Here you can see the front cover of one of those newspapers. It was dated the 1st of December 1941. Underneath it he's drawn the Norwegian flag, and underneath that he's put Norge, vårt land, which means Norway, our land. And inside those newspapers were reports. This was the little machine, the Gestetner machine that he used to produce those newspapers underneath the Germans. The Germans were upstairs, he was down in the cellar doing this. And you can see here is one of the reports dated the 11th of November 1941, and it's about the news from the Russian front and the German problems that they were having fighting the Russians up there. And he would send these newspapers out in little envelopes using different postage stamps, different handwriting, and then different post boxes as he travelled around the country, always making sure that he wasn't being followed. So, of course, that was a very, very dangerous thing to do. And then one day, he was approached by his young housekeeper, Haldis. She's on the left of the photograph. She was only 18 at the time, and she said, "I know what you're doing, and I want to help you." And so Haldis, at great risk to herself, began to deliver the newspapers. Then one day, a colleague of my father's came up from Oslo to visit him and asked him, in great secret of course, whether he would consider joining the resistance movement, XU. And my father said yes he would, providing he could carry on his work with his students at the Fiskepark school. He was given a little Leica camera and shown how to take photographs through the buttonhole of his coat, and how to process microfilm, and how to use invisible ink. And so he began on his travels to photograph German military installations up and down the coast. He travelled a lot with his work. And here you can see one of the letters that he received from the resistance movement. And it's an ordinary typed up letter, double spaced. At the top it says Kjære Sverre, dear Sverre, one of his pseudonyms. And the typed part of the letter is just an ordinary account of this man's train journey that he was taking. And then between the lines you can see the blue invisible ink that he probably processed using a potato, and those are quite detailed technical instructions of where he was to go and what he was to photograph. And at the bottom it says, "Please will you let us know how many soldiers are in that area and where they're billeted." Funny enough, these letters were always signed by E3, and we didn't know until recently who E3 was. And then I found a letter written to my father after the war, signed by E3 Øyvind Berg. So we now know that it was Øyvind Berg who was E3. My father also sent microfilm underneath postage stamps. And a man said to me a while ago at one of my talks, "Well, how could you do that when the Germans were checking all the posts?" And I said, "Well, I didn't know, but that's what he told me." And then about 5 years ago, I was clearing out our garage, and the roof was leaking. And at the back of the garage was an old cardboard box, and it was getting wet. I thought, well, I'll just take it in and sort out what's there. And when I took the box out, a little envelope fell out, no bigger than that. And when I emptied the envelope, there were lots of little micro-documents that fell out. And one of the things that fell out was this little stamp, still attached to an envelope, a piece of envelope. And you can see the date, it's marked Bergen, and it's date marked the 13th of July 1942. And when you peel the stamp back, there's the microfilm underneath. So I have my proof. The other way, now this is where it gets very exciting. Last November, I was, for those of you who've seen this talk before, this is new, I was visited by 2 Norwegians who came over. They found that I had all this information, all these documents I have had, they were mine. And they were lying around the house, and a lot of them I didn't know what they were. And they were terribly excited about it because they're going to write about it. And they spent 6 days with me, and by the second day they were saying to me, "Ellie, the information you have is of international importance. We have never seen this sort of material before. It's utterly extraordinary." And he said, these stamps, these were 2 little hand-drawn maps that was still attached to an envelope. And on the right-hand side, you can see a little piece of stamp still attached to the green part. But this chap said to me, "If you see these ridges down the centre, I don't know if you can see that ridge. Can you see the ridge going down the centre of the stamp? This is where it becomes spine-tingling." He said, your father, and we found several of these stamps with this ridge, he said, your father cut a slither off a matchstick. Into that matchstick he had drilled a very, very fine hole with a pin, and into that hole he was able to put a tiny dot of microfilm with between 12 and 15 A4 sides of information on it. And that went through the sensor. So he said, we knew about this, but we've never ever seen it. And on the back of the stamps you can see the ridge where it's actually gone through. So that was before the age of computers. And it's extraordinary, isn't it, to think in 1942 that he was able to do that. Remember, he was a scientist. The other piece of information that I found, or that I heard, was that my father, rather than working on his own Northern resistance movement, XU, was actually instrumental in setting up a cell of around 80 other agents in that area. He was responsible for recruiting and training all those agents. Not one of them was ever arrested, and not one of those agents knew about the others. He was the only one who knew them all. So he became very, very important to XU and to the Allied war effort throughout the war. Here we see him in Oslo, looking very tense. He would often have to get packages and collect things that he was supposed to deal with. In October of 1942, my father heard that his older brother Yakov, who was also a marine biologist, had been arrested by the Gestapo. Yakov was arrested outside Oslo and taken to Grini concentration camp, which lay outside the city, where he was held for 18 months and severely tortured. In fact, Yakov was tortured so badly, very often he'd be brought back to his cell unconscious. But Yakov never cracked under torture, never told the Germans who he was or what he was doing. And Yakov was actually head of intelligence of Mylor, the military wing of the resistance movement, and he was implicated in the intelligence gathering for the bombing of the heavy water at the Recount. The German judge at Yakov's trial was so impressed with his courage and fortitude under interrogation that he wanted the automatic death sentence that had been passed on him commuted. But at the beginning of 1944, Yakov was betrayed. And on the 3rd of March of that year, he was taken with 6 other prisoners in a truck to some woods outside Oslo, to a place called Trondheim, where they were made to dig their own graves, and they were shot. Before Yakov was arrested, he had worked with microfilm. And he discovered that while the microfilm was still wet, you could use a razor blade and very carefully peel the backing off the microfilm. And the microfilm itself could then be rolled into a tiny gelatinous ball. And one of Yakov's couriers had a hollow tooth with a cap on it. And they would unscrew the cap, pop the ball of microfilm in, put the cap back on, and this man could then go to Sweden and deliver the microfilm. So again, James Bond didn't think about that. Now, my father heard what had happened to Yakov. Here we see the prisoners lined up at Grini concentration camp. Look how thin they are. Twice in the spring of 1944, he was contacted by the resistance and told that the Gestapo were onto him, told to flee. Twice he fled into the mountains, and twice he returned to continue his work with his students and with XU, the other part of the resistance movement. Here we see a man called Ferme, who was a German Gestapo officer, very tall, very good looking, very charming, and utterly ruthless. And this was the man who interrogated Yakov on a daily basis before he was eventually executed. Here we see him in 1947, after he'd been arrested by the Allies, and he was executed at Akershus in 1947. My father heard what had happened to Yakov, and twice in the spring of that year, he fled into the mountains. Twice he returned. And then on the 18th of June, he went across to the neighbouring island of Otterøy with his little boat, and he climbed the cliffs above a U-boat submarine base, and he began to photograph it. This photograph was taken that morning. He was up there with a colleague. First of all, they were just doing some research with the animals up there and the fish, and before his colleague left to go back, he took a photograph of my father sitting on the edge of the cliff there looking out over the view. He then went home. My father then went down the cliff, unknown to this man, and began to photograph the German torpedo battery. This was one of the photographs he took. And the sunlight caught the lens of his camera. And he was spotted by some German guards, and he was arrested, and he was taken in front of the German commandant, who said to him, "You will be taken to Dombos, to Gestapo headquarters, where you will be interrogated." My father knew full well what that meant. "And you will be shot as a spy. There is no doubt you will be executed." And my father said he had a little pill that he managed to hide in the lining of his coat pocket. That, of course, was a cyanide pill. If you joined the resistance movement, you were offered this pill. He was then handcuffed behind his back and given a large armed marine guard, and then he was marched through the town of Molde. Several people saw him go, and word went round the town that day, "Sven er tatt." Sven is taken. With that message going round, other agents in that area were then able to flee into the mountain. It gave them time to get away. He was then put on board the ferry at the Molde Quay, and he was put inside a cabin where he was given an armed guard, and at that point he was handcuffed underneath his knees. The ferry then went across Molde Fjord to Åndalsnes, that was a town that we looked out onto, where the ferry was moored overnight, and he was due to be taken by train from Åndalsnes to Dombos the next day. Two things to bear in mind. One is that it's light all the way through the night in Molde during the summer in Norway, and also there'd been a very heavy snowfall that spring, so there was a lot of snow on the ground. 2 o'clock in the morning, he managed to escape. And I shan't tell you how he escaped because I want you to read his book. It takes too long, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody who does want to read the book. He walked off the ship. As he passed the bridge, the captain was Norwegian. He was working on the bridge. He saw him go, and he saluted him. And word went round Molde the next day, "Sven er rømt." Sven has escaped. And then he walked past 5 armed German guards who were stationed on the quay and the jetty and throughout the town, wishing them a cheery good night as he went. I told you he was cheeky. And then when he got outside the town, he felt it was safe. He jumped sideways into a river and began to wade up into those mountains. By jumping into water, he didn't leave his scent on the ground for the hounds to follow. And he told me once that within 45 minutes of his escape, he could hear the tracker dogs in the valley below. 900 soldiers were sent out to look for him with a pack of bloodhounds. The train was held up the next day for 8 hours. Everyone was put inside the barn, hands up facing the wall. They were all searched, and the train was searched from top to bottom. He managed to get himself up into those mountains, and now he began to trek across the mountains about 350 miles. And you can see Åndalsnes, which is just up there, and he went straight across and into the mountains of Sweden. There were 2 arrest warrants that went out for him, one in German and one in Norwegian. Again, I have these documents. This one in German is quite interesting. On the top right-hand corner, you can see the address where it was issued, which says Victoria Terrasse, Oslo. That was the most feared address in the whole of Norway throughout the war. It was where the Gestapo headquarters were, and it was where people were taken for execution and for interrogation. It's where Yakov was taken on a daily basis. So after the war, when my father got hold of these documents, he realized that would have been his destination. Now, he walked up into those mountains for the next 22 hours. And at the end of that time, he was very tired and hungry and cold and wet. And he said, suddenly, there was a rustle in the bushes in front of him. It was much too late to hide. And a young girl ran out into the footpath. And she said, "Don't be afraid. I've come to help you. My brothers and a friend are up at the precipice looking for you. We have a barn in the valley where we have some clean clothes and some warm food. Come along to the barn." And as he says in the book, again, I surrendered unconditionally. Now, her name was Rognabag. I knew her when I was a little girl. She was only about 18, and she and her husband Henry were part of a small group of friends and relatives who were helping escape prisoners to get up and into those mountains up over a certain precipice. About 15 years ago, I read his account for the second time. He wrote it in English after his escape. He wrote about his work on the island, how he was recruited into the resistance movement, how he dealt with the Germans on a day-to-day basis, very often with a gun pointed at him. He wrote about how he was arrested, how he managed to escape, and then he wrote about the route that he took across the mountains. So we knew the route. And I said to my sister Julie one day, we ought to walk the route and see if we could meet some of the people who helped him. And then, of course, in 2004, we had the 60th anniversary. So 5 of us were going to do this walk. We set off for Norway in July. Before we left for Norway, an old lady had written to me, called Selma, and she said, Ellie, when you come to Norway, please come and see me. I have a little gift for you. And so we set off for Norway. Oh, I must tell you, this is the barn that he was hidden in. And it's still there, apparently. Lots of prisoners were hidden in that. And also, there's this little log that went across the river to the barn. Apparently, they threaded a piece of rope. They attached a piece of rope to the end of that log, and they threaded it through to the barn, and they hung a bucket with some stones in it on the end of that rope, so that if anybody crossed the bridge, the bucket would vibrate and warn whoever was in the barn to get out and hide. So it was their warning. So there. But I read the book for the second time, and this old lady had written to me, and she said, please come and see me. I have this little gift for you. So we set off for Norway in 2004 in July, and the first person we called on was Selma. You can see her there with her husband and her brother. Selma, it turns out, was Ragnar Berg's sister. And very sadly, Ragnar Berg died in 2003, but her husband Henry was there to greet us. And Selma gave us a little speech in Norwegian and told us what she'd been doing during the war about this little group, helping escape prisoners. And then she sang a beautiful Norwegian song to us. And at the end of that song, she said, Ellie, I have a little gift for you. And you know, I'd completely forgotten her letter. And she went outside, and she brought back in an old brown paper bag. And she put it in my hand, and out came my father's old shoes. And those were the shoes he wore when he was arrested, and they're the shoes he wore when he escaped. And they're just little office shoes. You can see the laces are still tied, and the snow prints are still there across the toe, and his footprint is in them. I can tell you, there wasn't a dry eye in that room when those shoes came back. And one of Selma's parties said to him, you cannot go into the mountains in those shoes, you won't get through. There's too much snow. He said, I've got a brand new pair of mountain boots, we'll swap. And they swapped, and Selma kept the shoes. Hence the title of the book, Another Man's Shoes, so now you know where that comes from. Somebody thought this story was, or this talk was about making shoes, but it wasn't. It was like that. So I'll put the shoes on the table in a minute, and you can have a look at them afterwards. We left Selma, and we made our first climb up into the mountains. We were carrying 30-pound backpacks. The temperature up here drops to -8 or 9 at night in the middle of the summer, so it freezes. My father at this point was taken up into those mountains by 4 young men who were mountaineers. And this is a photograph taken of them the day after his escape. He describes this valley in great detail. He was given a door to carry, and they were all carrying planks of wooden windows, so that if they were stopped by German soldiers up there, they could say quite legitimately that they were going to build a hut. And he left the door on the mountainside, and the door is still there. So again, we felt that part of him was there with us on the mountain. We then came to this precipice. It's a 3,000-foot, almost sheer drop down into the Yankeesdal Valley on the left there. And there was a lot of snow on the mountain when he arrived with his friends. They didn't have ropes. They had to roll themselves off the top of the mountain and just hope that they stopped before they hit the rocks at the bottom. It does say in the book he was very frightened at that point. And then when we had to walk down it as well. We had to climb down. We had no ropes. And it took us 2 hours to get down. When he got to the bottom into the valley, his companions went back up the mountain and left him to walk up the valley to Finset Farm in the foreground there, where he was given food and shelter. And he was taken to the bedroom, the spare room upstairs. You can see the windows open there. He was told not to go near the window, just to stay in that room for 24 hours in case he was spotted by someone passing by. And in the afternoon of that day, young Christiansen said, who was only 10 at the time, he said, "I didn't know your father was with us." And he said, "I went into the room to fetch something," and he said, "Your father was sitting on the edge of the bed, and he saw me, and he was very frightened, because he thought, this boy is going to go to school tomorrow, and he's going to say, well, guess who we've got in our spare room?" But he said, "I went to school the next day, and I never breathed a word." So even the children knew how dangerous it was to talk. Before he left, my father was given this little hand-drawn map on a piece of A4, it's a piece of greaseproof paper actually, sandwich paper, that for the next part of his walk across. Within a few days, within the next day actually, Bert had to leave us, and Oliver left us as well, my son Oliver, who was coming with us. He left after about 8 days, so there were just the 3 of us women left. We came up to this area, and you can see it's quite bleak up here. My father describes crossing 3 ravines in this area, and he was climbing up through one of the ravines at about 2 o'clock one morning. He would walk for 18 hours through the night and then rest during the day. And he said as he came up through one of the ravines, he just happened to glance to his right, and on the skyline, about 1,000 feet away, were 2 German soldiers with binoculars. And so he lay down and stayed very still until he felt it was safe to pass and to go on. And then he passed by Grimsdalshytta, which is a group of huts where you can buy a meal and camp for the night, at about 5 o'clock in the morning. For obvious reasons, he didn't go near the huts. He just skirted in the valley below that ridge and then passed by. Now, we were climbing through the 3rd ravine, and we would go upwards and sideways, and there was a lot of loose scree on the ground. It was very treacherous. And, you know, it's quite slippery, loose scree. And Linda, one of our party, the 3rd woman with us, had a very, very nasty fall. She suddenly tripped. Now, luckily, she didn't lose consciousness. She slammed her face down into the rock. But when she got up, she had cut her head very badly across the forehead, so she was losing a lot of blood, and she'd also broken her nose. So at that point, Yuli, my sister, and I were in a lot of trouble. We managed to get her to Grimsdalshytta, and Yuli took her into the ladies' loo to try and patch her up a little bit more. By the evening, her eyes were beginning to swell and close with the swelling. You can see the cut on top of her forehead there, and also her broken nose. And I went into reception to tell them what had happened and to see if we could get some help. Yuli and I both speak fairly fluent Norwegian, but in my haste, I had forgotten the word for cut. And I thought, well, it's either skål or skalv. I'll go with skalv, because the dictionary's at the bottom of the rucksack. So, in my best Norwegian, I explained to this lady what had happened. And then afterwards, I looked up the word skalv. And I realised what I'd said. And I'd said to her, hun har falt opp på fjellet, og stakkars, hun har brukket nesa, og hun har et stort skarv på hodet. And when you translate it, it means she's had a fall up on the mountain. Poor thing, she's broken her nose, and she has a huge cormorant on her head. A skål is a cut, a skarv is a cormorant. And you know, this lady didn't bat an eyelid. I think she just thought, you know, dippy woman, shock, mountain air shock, and all that. And so Linda was flown, taken to hospital and then flown home to the UK, and Yuli and I were on our own. So we made a pact. We said that if either of us had an accident on the mountain, the other would have to leave and go for help. And we made it to halfway. This is Nesset, which lies 2,000 feet up in the Rondane Mountains. My father arrived very early at Nesset, and he stayed very hidden for a couple of hours, just watching to see if the German soldiers were there. And when he felt it was safe, he went and knocked on the door and was given a hero's welcome. And they took him to an island which lies at the foot of that hill. There's a lake and an uninhabited island on the lake. And they took him to the island where they pitched a tent, where he was to stay for 5 weeks, while the resistance movement arranged for false papers and a passport to be got to him, because he had no papers to get across the border into Sweden. And he said one day he was sitting in the tent darning some socks, when he suddenly heard, and he said, I looked out of the tent flap, And there was a funny-looking fellow wading up through the heather towards me. And it was his other brother, Knut, who had heard what had happened to him and had gone to Nesset to see if he passed by. And Knut was also working for the resistance and was able to act as go-between and get him the false papers and passport. While we were there, all in Nesset came across from the neighbouring farm to check the route with me. We had very good maps with us, and I was very glad when he said, yes, you're on the right route, this is exactly where your father went. And we left Nesset. We had about 8 days to go. By now, our feet were suffering quite badly. We had very bad blisters. My father was talking about the same thing in the book. His ankles were very swollen and painful, and the soles of our feet were becoming very painful with the amount of walking. But we were getting much closer now. This is Harnestar, a 500-year-old farmhouse, where my father was given food. He was told not to knock at the door, just to walk straight in. And he said as he walked into the kitchen, there was a young girl standing at the stove cooking with her back to him, and she didn't turn around to see his face. She didn't want to see his face for obvious reasons. But we were now in wolf and bear country, and there were wolverines around. You can see the border of Sweden in the distance, and we were following a pack of wolves up there that were killing sheep. And we met a man who was tracking them one day. They compensate the farmers for the number of sheep killed. And we stopped to chat, and I said, I know that a wolf is harmless, contrary to popular belief. They won't come near you. But I said, what do we do if we meet a brown bear? He said, just keep walking and talking, don't make eye contact. The only time we did see someone up here was a beautiful sunny day, and we were passing by some huts. And sitting outside one of the huts was a man, completely startled, reading a newspaper. And as we went by, he sort of went, oh, like this, you know. And we waved. We didn't look. We waved and passed by. And afterwards, I felt so sorry for this man, because I thought, there you are, in the middle of nowhere, beautiful sunny day, you're on your own, you take your clothes off to read the newspaper, and two women walk by. Same as going for a pee on the mountainside, and just at that point, a low-flying helicopter goes slowly over the The last day, we walked from 9 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock that night. We went through the Solenkletten. We were heading for this little lake, which lies 10 miles from the border of Sweden. It has a footpath that runs round it, and my father had an arrangement through the resistance movement to meet a man called Sømme on that footpath at 2 o'clock one morning, and Sømme would give him a map for the border. He wouldn't take it, but he would give him a map. But it was pouring with rain that night, and my father was late for the rendezvous, and very afraid that Sømme would have left and gone home. But in fact, Sømme waited for him, and they stopped, and they met, and they chatted for about 10 minutes, about nothing much in particular, each one very wary of the other. And after about 10 minutes, my father produced a cigarette case from his pocket and opened them up to offer the man a cigarette. And lying on top of the cigarettes was a piece of paper which had been cut in a certain way. And then Sømme produced the other half of that paper from his pocket and married the two together. And at that point he said, oh, I see you are the right person. And then he was able to give him the map. So we made it to within 10 miles of the border. By then we had run out of food and we had no map for that area. So we decided to call it quits, and we went back to Oslo. And the first thing we did was to hit the shops and buy sandals. Look how swollen my feet are. But before we left Norway, we wanted to hold a little farewell ceremony to honour my father and the people involved in his story. He died when I was 9 years old in Molde. We had not been able to go to his funeral. We were not allowed to go to his funeral. We were sent to school the next day, and we felt we hadn't got closure on his life and his death. So we held this little farewell ceremony, and we lit candles for every person involved in his story. One for Yakov, one for Knut, and various other people, one for my father. And one candle we lit was for the soldier who'd been guarding my father when he escaped, because we heard that he was taken to Donbass and shot in his place. So we felt that his spirit was bound up in the story as well. And then we sent the candles down the river, and they stayed alight for about half an hour. It was very cathartic for us. And we also burnt a pair of socks, smelly, dirty old socks, on the bonfire as a burnt offering to him. And I think he would have appreciated that. He would have loved that. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my story. I have just one photo to show you, which is quite famous. You may have seen this before. It's been in the Telegraph, the Times, it's been on the news and various other publications. It was taken of my father in the 1930s tree leaping. Now he and his brothers used to spend a lot of time in the mountains as young men, and they discovered that if you pulled a sapling down into the snow, you could use it like a pole vault and then ping 50 or 60 yards across the snow. Well, great fun, but you know he used that technique after his escape so that he didn't leave his footprints in the snow for the soldiers to follow. So that little technique probably helped to save his life. And I was talking to an ex-SAS soldier recently who said to me, I've heard of that technique being done, but I've never seen it done. If you want the books, I can promise you a good story. People have said to me, I was up all night reading it. Another man said recently, I've read it again and again and again. The first part of it is the Sømme story and our story as a family, very short part. The main part is my father's story. As he wrote it, we've left it completely unedited. The last part is Yakov's story. Before Yakov was executed, somebody managed to smuggle in a tiny stub of pencil. And he got hold of some toilet tissue in the prison, and he wrote a speech which he gave to his fellow inmates before he was executed. And that speech became very famous, and it's still in existence, and it's in the book. So if you read that speech, you'll understand what the Norwegians feel about German occupation and about being occupied. As I say, I can promise you, I'm very happy to sign them for you. They make very good presents, may I say. There are lots and lots of books, and my costume, my bunad is on the table there, which my mum made for me when I was 8. And of course, I've got the shoes up there as well, and you can have a look. So, are there any questions? Yes? One or two? Any questions? Okay, well, do come up and have a look at all the books and the bits and pieces there. And if you want to ask questions while I'm there, I'm very happy to sign them. They're $9.95, and as I say, I'm very happy. Thank you.
Well, Ellie, that was absolutely wonderful. I was absolutely floored with that talk. The memories, the way you intertwined the original war story with 60 years later retracing the steps was just absolutely marvellous. I have to admit, the Norwegian story of the war is an area of the war I know very little about. And the techniques and scientific knowledge needed in order to do what he did is just mind-blowing. So either one will be buying the book. So thank you so much for your time and for telling us all about Sven Sømme. Thank you. Can you thank everybody?
Part of the Norwegian story, very, very briefly, which probably most people don't know. The north of Norway was obliterated at the end of the occupation. As the Germans withdrew, they left a scorched earth policy in the north of Norway, up in Narvik and up in Hammerfest and up there. And there were thousands of people who had to flee their homes, and for a lot of the war they lived in caves and in the ground. And they had nothing to eat. They were starving. They literally starved. So if you get the chance to read about that, there's a book called Terror in the Arctic, which I have just read. And it really opens your mind to the horrendous cruelty of the Germans, the German army and the Nazis during the Second World War, and what the Norwegians suffered as a country. And that's very well worth reading as well. So Terror in the Arctic, as well as Another Man's Sheep.